Keanu Reeves had always been a man of quiet reflection, someone who valued the past as much as the present. So when he found himself back in Toronto for an event, he decided to take a detour. A familiar road led him to a place he hadn't seen in decades, his old high school. He hadn't planned on making a big entrance. No cameras, no publicists, no one to turn his visit into a spectacle. He just wanted to walk those halls again, to remember the boy he once was before the world knew his name. The school had changed, but only slightly. The red brick walls remained, the rows of lockers still lined the hallways, though their paint had been refreshed over time. As Keanu stepped inside, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead brought back memories. The sound of laughter, the nervous shuffle of students before a test, the echo of sneakers against the gym floor. Then he saw him. A lone figure moving slowly down the hallway, mop in hand, bucket rolling alongside him. His movements were deliberate, practiced. The way he held the broom, the quiet patience in his stance, it stirred something in Keanu's memory. He took a step closer. The man's hair was completely white now, his uniform clean but visibly worn, a name tag pinned to his chest. His body had changed with age, but Keanu knew those eyes. It was Mr. Alves. Keanu's heart clenched. He had never forgotten the janitor, the quiet man who had always been there in the background of his youth. But why was he still here? The old man paused, straightened up with a soft grunt, and turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, slowly, realization dawned. Keanu? Mr. Alves' voice was rough with age, but warmth lingered underneath. Keanu let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Yeah, it's me. Mr. Alves tilted his head slightly, as if looking through time. Well, I'll be. Keanu stepped forward. It's been a long time. The janitor nodded. A very long time. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Keanu had always known Mr. Alves as a steady presence, never demanding attention, but always there. As a boy, he hadn't realized how much the man had seen, how much he had noticed. But now, looking at him, Keanu knew. Memories surfaced, him, a frustrated teenager, sitting alone in the gym after a rough day. The sound of footsteps. A mop bucket coming to a stop. Tough day? He had barely lifted his head. Just nodded. Alves hadn't pried. He had just sat beside him. You know, people think I just clean floors, he had said. But I see everything. Keanu had glanced at him then, confused. I see the kids who think no one notices them, Mr. Alves had continued. The ones fighting battles no one else knows about. A pause. You're not as invisible as you think, kid. At the time, those words hadn't meant much. But now, standing here, Keanu realized just how deeply they had stayed with him. The present came back into focus. Keanu studied the man before him. Time had carved deep lines into his face, and his body carried the weight of decades of hard work. His hands, rough and veined, still gripped the mop handle with quiet steadiness. But what hit Keanu the most wasn't the wrinkles or the gray hair. It was the exhaustion, not just physical, but something deeper. Keanu swallowed. I never expected to find you here. Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. I never left. The words were said lightly, but something in his tone made Keanu's stomach tighten. He glanced at the mop, the employee badge, the way the old man shifted his weight as if trying to ease some unseen pain. Mr. Alves, Keanu hesitated. Are you still working full-time? The janitor's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Work keeps me moving. You know how it is. That wasn't an answer. It was a deflection. Keanu saw it now, the tremble in his fingers, the stiffness in his steps. This wasn't just a job. This was survival. An 80-year-old man shouldn't have to be here, still scrubbing floors. Keanu felt something sharp twist in his chest. Why was he still here, and what was he supposed to do about it? That night, Keanu couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Sitting in his dimly lit living room, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. His mind kept replaying the way Mr. Alves had shifted his weight, the quiet exhaustion in his voice, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That he had always assumed that people like Mr. Alves, those who spent their lives helping others, would be taken care of in return. That after years of hard work, they would have a comfortable retirement. But that clearly wasn't the case. Keanu reached for his phone. That he needed answers. A few calls later, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Retirement for school janitors? Barely enough to scrape by. The pension was meager, nowhere near enough to cover rent, medical expenses, or even daily necessities in a city like Toronto. Some had to keep working well past retirement age just to survive. That wasn't right. Keanu ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. This man had spent decades keeping the school running, making sure students had clean classrooms, safe hallways, a place to grow. And yet, when it was his turn to rest, society had failed him. Keanu's grip tightened around his phone. This wasn't just about money. Throwing cash at the problem wouldn't fix it in the long run. Donations faded. Headlines came and went. But real change? That had to be built to last. He grabbed a notebook from the table and flipped it open. What if Mr. Alves didn't just retire? What if he became something more? Keanu thought back to his school days, to the quiet moments when Mr. Alves had been more than just a janitor. He had seen the kids who struggled. He had noticed the ones slipping through the cracks. He had offered wisdom in small, passing conversations, never asking for anything in return. And that's when it hit Keanu. The school didn't just need better wages for workers. It needed Mr. Alves' wisdom. A mentorship program, where students could learn from a man who had spent decades guiding them in quiet, unseen ways. Keanu underlined the words in his notebook. Life lessons with Mr. Alves. Not charity, not a handout. A purpose. Keanu leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the pen still in his hand. He had a plan, but the hardest part, convincing Mr. Alves to accept it. The next morning, Keanu was back at the school. This time, he wasn't just visiting. He had a mission. Mr. Alves was in the janitor's office, a small, cluttered space tucked away near the maintenance area. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the old man sat at a worn metal desk, carefully sewing a tear in his shirt. His hands were steady but slow, the movements deliberate. Keanu knocked softly. Mr. Alves. The janitor looked up, surprised to see him again. Keanu, back so soon? Keanu stepped inside, offering a small smile. I had to come back. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Mr. Alves chuckled, shaking his head. No need to worry about an old janitor like me. But Keanu wasn't convinced. He sat across from him, watching as the elderly man finished stitching his shirt. Then, he asked the question that had been weighing on his heart. Why are you still working here, Mr. Alves? The air in the room shifted. The question hung between them like an unspoken truth finally given a voice. Mr. Alves sighed, setting the needle aside. He didn't look at Keanu when he spoke. Because I have no choice, son. Keanu leaned in, listening intently. My pension isn't enough. I worked my whole life, but the little I get each month barely covers rent and food. The cost of living went up, but my income stayed the same. Keanu clenched his jaw. And your family? Do you have anyone who can help? Mr. Alves shook his head. No family left. My wife passed away years ago. We never had kids. His voice softened. It's just me now. Keanu's chest ached. He could see it now, the exhaustion, the silent resignation. This man, who had dedicated his life to quietly helping others, had been left behind. But there was more. Mr. Alves rubbed his knee absent-mindedly, wincing slightly. Keanu noticed. Are you in pain? The janitor hesitated before nodding. It's my knee. Doctor says I need surgery, but I can't afford it. He exhaled. And if I stop working, I won't be able to pay my bills. A small, tired chuckle. So I keep going. Keanu's fists clenched. The injustice of it all hit him like a wave. This man had spent his life serving others, making sure kids like Keanu had a clean, safe place to learn. And yet, here he was, struggling to survive. Keanu felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about helping, this was about making it right. But how could he do it in a way that Mr. Alves would accept? Keanu took a deep breath. Your knee's not getting better, and you know it. You need surgery, and I'm going to take care of it. The old man frowned, shaking his head immediately. I don't take handouts, Keanu. Keanu had expected this. He nodded, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. It's not a handout. It's a job requirement. Mr. Alves' brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Keanu tapped the paper. A mentorship program. You won't be a janitor anymore. You'll be a mentor, teaching students about life, about hard work, about resilience. But you can't do that limping around in pain. So the surgery? It's not charity. It's part of your new role. Silenced at Mr. Alves stared at the paper, his fingers tracing the words "Life Lessons with Mr. Alves." Keanu could see the battle in his eyes. Mr. Alves didn't want to stop working because work gave him purpose, but this wasn't stopping, this was becoming something greater. Mr. Alves exhaled slowly. And what if I say no? Keanu shrugged, a playful grin on his face. Then I'll just keep coming back until you say yes. A pause. Then a chuckle. Mr. Alves shook his head, smirking. You always were a stubborn kid. Keanu smirked back. Learned from the best. The old man picked up the paper, reading it one more time. Then, finally, he sighed. Guess I don't have a choice, huh? Keanu grinned. Nope. Within weeks, Mr. Alves had his knee surgery. Keanu made sure he had the best doctors, the best care, and when Mr. Alves woke up, groggy from anesthesia, Keanu was there, arms crossed, smirking. Better heal fast, old man. The kids are waiting. Recovery wasn't easy. Mr. Alves was used to being on his feet, moving, working. Resting was foreign to him, but Keanu made sure he had no choice. The hospital stay was short, but Keanu had arranged for a comfortable recovery at a rehabilitation center. Every time Mr. Alves tried to argue, Keanu would raise an eyebrow and say, "Doctor's orders." After a few weeks, the old man was walking better than he had in years. His steps were steadier, his pain had lessened. And though he would never admit it out loud, there was a lightness in his movements that hadn't been there before. Then, one morning, Keanu arrived with something unexpected. A stack of papers. Mr. Alves glanced at them warily. More forms? Keanu smirked. Your new job description. The janitor turned mentor took the papers in his hands. The title at the top read, The Alves Mentorship Program, a place for guidance and growth. It was real. This wasn't just some idea Keanu had thrown together in the middle of the night. It was happening. The school board had approved it. The administration had given its support. Students would now have a space to talk, to learn, to be heard. A space where someone like Mr. Alves, someone with wisdom, patience, and a lifetime of experience, could guide them, and he wouldn't be doing it alone. Keanu had set up funding for guest speakers, workshops, and scholarships in Mr. Alves' name. The program wouldn't just help kids now, it would continue long after they were both gone. Mr. Alves let out a slow breath. His fingers trembled slightly as he ran them over the paper. This is too much. Keanu shook his head. It's exactly what you deserve. For a long moment, the old man said nothing. He just sat there, staring at the document in his hands. Then, he nodded. I guess I better get to work. The first day of the program was unlike anything Mr. Alves had ever experienced. He was used to students passing him by in the halls, barely noticing him. But now, they were looking to him. Asking him questions. They sat in a circle in the newly renovated mentorship room, once an unused classroom, now a space filled with comfortable chairs, books, and a whiteboard covered in Keanu's messy handwriting from when he had helped set things up. A boy with his hoodie pulled low over his face hesitated before asking, "How do you know if you're on the right path?" Mr. Alves took a moment before answering. "You don't. Not always. But if you keep going, you'll figure it out." A girl with tired eyes raised her hand. "What if you feel like nobody sees you?" Mr. Alves smiled softly. "Then you remind yourself that the right people will. It just takes time." And so it went. One question after another. One answer at a time. By the end of the session, the room felt lighter. Some of the kids lingered, asking if they could come back tomorrow. Mr. Alves simply nodded. Doors always open. Keanu, watching from the doorway, smiled. He had known this would work, because once upon a time, Mr. Alves had helped a lost kid like him, and now, he was helping a whole new generation. But Keanu wasn't done yet. He had one last surprise. Weeks passed, and the mentorship program flourished. At first, only a handful of students showed up, unsure of what to expect. But word spread quickly. Mr. Alves wasn't just there to talk. He listened. He didn't sugarcoat things. He didn't lecture. He simply shared the kind of wisdom that came from a life spent watching, learning, and understanding people. Keanu made sure to visit often, slipping in quietly to watch from the back of the room. He saw the way students opened up, the way they lingered after sessions, as if reluctant to leave the space Mr. Alves had created. But something was still missing. Keanu could see it in the old man's eyes. This program gave him purpose, but there was a weight there, something unresolved. One evening, Keanu sat across from Mr. Alves in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. "You ever think about taking a break?" Keanu asked casually, sipping his drink. Mr. Alves chuckled. "This is my break, kid." Keanu smirked but didn't let it go. "I mean a real one. A trip." The old man scoffed. "Where would I go?" Keanu leaned back, watching him. "I did some digging." Mr. Alves raised an eyebrow. "You have a brother?" The old man's smile faded. His fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "Hadn't seen him in a long time." Keanu tilted his head. "How long?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "Almost 40 years." Keanu exhaled, setting down his cup. "Why?" Mr. Alves looked down at the table. "Life happens. You get busy. You tell yourself you'll call next week, and next week turns into years. And before you know it, you don't even know where to start." Keanu nodded slowly. He understood that. He had lost people, too, but unlike Mr. Alves, he still had time. "You ever think about reaching out?" Keanu asked. The old man gave a soft, tired chuckle. "And say what?" "Hey, sorry I disappeared for 4 decades?" Keanu smiled. "Yeah. Something like that." Mr. Alves shook his head. "Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't know where to find him." Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a plain ticket. Mr. Alves stared at it. Keanu leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I found him." Silence. Mr. Alves swallowed hard. "Keanu, no arguments," Keanu said, cutting him off with a grin. "It's already booked." Mr. Alves hesitated, his eyes fixed on the ticket as if it might vanish. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "You really don't give up, do you?" Keanu smirked. "Learned from the best." A week later, Mr. Alves stood in an airport for the first time in decades. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handle of his small, worn suitcase. Keanu stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You sure you're ready for this?" Mr. Alves let out a slow breath. "I spent my whole life making sure other people were okay." He glanced at Keanu, eyes filled with something deep and unspoken. "Maybe it's time I let someone take care of me for once." Keanu nodded. "Your brother's going to be happy to see you." The old man swallowed. I hope so. A silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Then, Mr. Alves turned to Keanu, his expression softer than before. You've done a lot for me, kid. But you know something? Keanu tilted his head. What's that? A small smile formed on Mr. Alves' lips. You were always a good kid. I just helped you see it. Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat. The final boarding call echoed through the airport. Mr. Alves squeezed Keanu's shoulder briefly, then picked up his suitcase. See you around, kid. Keanu gave him a nod. See you around, old man. And with that, Mr. Alves disappeared through the gate, stepping into the next chapter of his life. As Keanu walked out of the airport, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something old, something that had been with him for weeks now. A notebook. Its leather cover was frayed, the pages yellowed with Mr. Alves had given it to him before he left. Keanu flipped it open, scanning the pages filled with messy, rushed handwriting, his own, from decades ago. Words he had long forgotten, thoughts from a boy who had once felt lost in a world too big for him. And then, near the end, one passage stopped him cold. If I ever make it, if I ever become someone, I hope I remember what it was like to feel lost. I hope I never forget that sometimes, all a person needs is for someone to believe in them. Keanu exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Mr. Alves had believed in him before he even knew how to believe in himself, and now, because of him, generations of kids would have that same chance. Months later, Keanu returned to the school. The mentorship program was thriving. The room that had once been an unused classroom was now filled with life, laughter, and conversation. But today, something was different. A new sign had been placed above the entrance. The Alves Educational Center, a place for second chances. Keanu stood in front of it for a long time, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He could almost hear the old man's voice in his head. You always were a stubborn kid. Keanu chuckled softly. Learned from the best. And with that, he stepped inside, ready to continue the work they had started together, because some people change the world loudly and others do it quietly, one small act of kindness at a time. Months had passed since Mr. Alves boarded that plane. Keanu had kept in touch, calling him every few weeks, making sure he was settling in with his brother. Each time, Mr. Alves would brush it off, saying, "Don't worry about me, kid. Focus on the school." And so Keanu did. The Alves Educational Center had grown beyond what either of them had imagined. What had started as a simple mentorship program had become a vital part of the school. At first, it was just a space for students to talk, somewhere to feel seen, to ask for advice. Then, a former teacher volunteered to help. Then a counselor. Then alumni started coming back, wanting to give back. Within months, it was more than just a mentorship program. It was a movement. Keanu watched as students who had once felt invisible found a place to belong. A shy boy, once too nervous to speak in class, now led discussions. A girl who had struggled with school was helping tutor younger students. Kids who had once walked through the halls feeling unseen were now part of something bigger. And Keanu, he had never felt more at peace. One evening, as he sat in the mentorship room after hours, flipping through an old yearbook, the door creaked open. A young teacher, Ms. Patel, stepped inside. "Hey, I didn't expect to find you here," she said with a smile. Keanu chuckled. "I could say the same to you." She hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "I wanted to show you something." Keanu took it and opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. "Students have been writing about what this place means to them," Ms. Patel explained. "Some of them don't feel comfortable saying things out loud, but they wanted to share." Keanu scanned the pages, his throat tightening. "Before this place, I didn't think anyone noticed me. Now I know I matter. I used to think I wasn't smart enough to do anything important. But Mr. Alves always said I was stronger than I knew. I think he was right. This place saved my life." Keanu closed the folder, exhaling that Ms. Patel sat across from him. "You did something amazing here." Keanu shook his head. "We did." She smiled. Well, it's only going to get bigger. The board wants to expand the program to other schools. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Wait, what? They want to take the Alves Educational Center citywide. Maybe even further. Keanu blinked. This had started as a simple act, helping one man, making sure he wasn't forgotten, and now, it was turning into something even bigger. He leaned back, rubbing his chin. Mr. Alves would have something sarcastic to say about all this. Ms. Patel smirked. Probably. Keanu looked around the room, taking it all in. What had started as a way to repay a debt to one man had become something neither of them had expected, and somehow, he had a feeling this was just the beginning. Keanu sat in the mentorship room, staring at the framed photograph on the wall. It was a picture of Mr. Alves, taken years ago, probably without his knowledge. He was mid-laugh, holding a mop in one hand, a rag slung over his shoulder. The plaque beneath it read, Mr. Alves, more than a janitor, a guardian of dreams. Keanu smirked. You'd hate this, old man, but he also knew that, deep down, Mr. Alves would be proud. The Alves Educational Center had taken on a life of its own. The school board had approved funding to expand it across multiple schools, ensuring that every student, no matter their background, had access to guidance, mentorship, and a place to belong. Keanu had attended the first meeting about the expansion, but he knew this was bigger than him now. This wasn't about his name. This was about keeping Mr. Alves' legacy alive. And speaking of the old man, Keanu checked his phone. No messages. Mr. Alves had been living with his brother for nearly a year now. Their relationship, strained by time and silence, had slowly started to rebuild, but Keanu hadn't seen him since that day at the airport until now. There was a knock at the door. Keanu stood, smoothing out his shirt before opening it, and there he was. Mr. Alves stood in the doorway, looking healthier than he had in years. He wore a sharp new jacket, clearly not something he would have bought for himself, and a familiar smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Took me a while to find the place, Mr. Alves said. Keanu crossed his arms. Yeah? You manage without a mop? The old man chuckled. Barely. Keanu stepped aside, motioning him in. Mr. Alves walked into the room slowly, his eyes scanning the space. He took in the walls covered in student projects, the bookshelves stacked with resources, the circle of chairs where kids sat to talk about their futures. Then his gaze landed on the framed photo. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, you really did all this? Keanu shrugged. We did. Mr. Alves ran a hand over the plaque, shaking his head. I was just a janitor, kid. Keanu's expression softened. No. You weren't. Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Then, without looking away from the photo, Mr. Alves spoke again. So, what do I do now? Keanu grinned. Anything you want. The old man turned, studying Keanu the way he had all those years ago, back when he was just a lost teenager sitting in the gym. Then, with a small nod, he pulled up a chair, and just like that, Mr. Alves was home.